In the city of Nisus in 443 AD, a scene fresh from the apocalypse was unfolding. A small group of monks were the only survivors of a brutal siege and massacre that had seen the town destroyed and its people slaughtered. Their haunting singing and chanting amidst the ruins must have seemed like the end of the world. Today we will learn how this and many other cities were destroyed by the self-proclaimed scourge of God, or as history calls him, Attila the Hun. This is Knowledge Voyage. The devastation of Nisus in modern Serbia was one of many Balkan cities ravaged by the Huns. But the story of this campaign begins decades earlier, over 1,000 miles away on the steppes of Kazakhstan, believed to be the Huns' original homeland. The decision of the Huns to migrate en masse into Europe was one of the main reasons the Roman Empire collapsed. This mass movement of Huns pushed massive human waves of other tribes like the Goths, Burgundians, Lombardians and Vandals into the Roman Empire, many of them desperately seeking sanctuary. As these mass waves of refugees poured in, some took up arms and fought their way in, and at the Battle of Adrianople in 375 AD, Rome's army was so broken that it could do nothing but sit back and watch as its long borders were pierced by the incomers, many with violent intentions. To try and quash this, the Romans hired Hun mercenaries like Ruar, who led his forces on a cruel campaign in France against the Goth intruders. This would be the first encounter between the Huns and the Romans, and the campaign taught the Huns two things. Firstly, that the Roman Empire had many riches to plunder, and secondly, that if it was so desperate for manpower, it could easily be attacked and exploited when troops were busy elsewhere. Hun chieftain Ruar died and was replaced by his nephew, the infamous Attila. According to legend, a shepherd boy found a mysterious sword stuck in the earth glowing whilst out on the steppes and gave it to Attila. Attila proclaimed it was the sword of the Roman god of war, Mars, who had sent him to scourge the newly Christian Romans. Attila is believed to be from a respected clan of Huns, and unlike European leaders, who inherited leadership from their father, steppe clans like the Huns could be led by whoever demonstrated sufficient strength, and to demonstrate this strength, Attila had his cousins killed, and later killed his older brother Bleda. As undisputed leader of the Huns, he would spearhead a campaign of violence that would push the Roman Empire to the very brink. Attila's moment would come thanks to fighting on the other side of the slowly crumbling Roman Empire, and a little bit of false flag action. In 439 AD, Vandals in North Africa were threatening to seize the Roman port of Carthage and the surrounding fertile crop fields. The Romans could not sit back and watch this happen, and sent troops to Sicily to confront them. Attila, able to pick his moments brilliantly, then struck. With the Roman army away in Africa, the Roman cities of the Balkans were wide open, but what was needed was a false flag to justify his attack. At the city of Margum that marked the border between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Huns, Attila's forces humiliated the Romans by refusing to dismount their horses during talks. Instead, the Romans had to mount their own horses before talks could even begin. Attila accused a Christian bishop of robbing Hun tombs and therefore violating a peace treaty they had signed earlier. The false flag claim a bishop was engaging in late-night grave robbing would be the cover for a devastating campaign. Attila then ravaged the city of Margum, which was completely empty of defending troops due to them being deployed in Africa. The Huns specialised in cavalry warfare, allowing them to cover vast distances quickly, and their bows and arrows were deeply feared. Hun raiders launched mass attacks on cities like Sofia, Belgrade, Plovdiv, and many others in a pitiless campaign of terror. Attila's campaign had done three things. Firstly, it had punched holes all along the Eastern Roman Empire's border and left it vulnerable to future attack. Secondly, the masses of loot and wealth taken from these cities could be shared out to Attila's lieutenants, and thus secure his position by enriching loyalists. Finally, it intimidated the Romans into signing a peace treaty. This treaty saw a sum of gold equivalent to 3% of the entire Roman Empire's wealth transferred every year to Attila, and in exchange, Attila agreed not to attack. He also insisted all payments be made to him personally, to prevent other ambitious chiefs siphoning off funds, but just a few years later, his appetite was whetted again, and this time it was not politics or false flags, but a very real intervention from Mother Nature. In 447 AD, a massive earthquake hit Constantinople and broke the city walls, leaving the city open to invasion. Emperor Theodosius walked barefoot through the city, crying and praying and begging God to save the city. In the meantime, citizens worked around the clock to see if they could repair the walls. It was a race between the citizens and the Hun armies that had heard of the earthquake and were storming south. On the way, the Huns yet again engaged in mass looting, rape and murder in regions only just recovering from their first campaign. As it happened, the walls were rebuilt in just enough time. One fact helping them was the Hun war wagons were now so heavy with war loot that their army had been slowed down on the way. Attila chose not to attack the city now its walls were repaired. The Huns sent an ambassador to demand a new treaty, and the Hun ambassador's name was Edecco. Edecco was wined and dined and then offered a large bribe if he could kill Attila. Edecco agreed, and now Rome needed an excuse to get to Attila, and that excuse was a diplomatic voyage to his court beyond the Danube. Edecco acted as a guide, and the small group of Romans and their Hun guide snaked their way through the Balkans. On the way, they saw nothing but ruined cities, burnt-out field and bleached skeletons. It must have been a worrying reminder of the destructive power of the man the Roman delegation were on their way to meet. Eventually they reached Attila's court, which was a large tent surrounded by Hun war wagons and some smaller tents. Attila threw a banquet for his Roman guests, and the account of the banquet was written by the Roman guest Priscus. His account is the most detailed description in existence of how the Huns worked and what Attila was like. He records that Huns had flattened faces, as they strapped boards to their babies' faces to make them flatter. This would have made them unsettling in appearance to the Romans. Speaking of which, the only physical description in existence of Attila comes from this account. Attila is described as dark complexion, with a slightly grey beard. He is also wide-chested, large-headed, and has small eyes. The feast unfolded, and the Romans noticed that whilst most guests ate from gold and silver plates, Attila himself was content with a simple wooden board. He did not laugh during the evening's entertainment, and only showed one moment of softness when hugging his young son Ernak. In the Roman world, a leader who behaved with this level of restraint and frugality at a banquet was respected. The Romans went to see Attila again the next day and wished him well. Through his interpreter, Attila coldly replied that he wished the Roman emperor as much good as he now understood the emperor wished him. Unknown to the Roman ambassadors, Attila had found the plot against him. But rather than react in the moment, Attila felt he could spin this to his advantage. He would allow the Romans to return to Constantinople to collect the gold and then come back to the Danube to pay the assassin. And when they returned, they could be searched and the gold found. Much like his false flag claim about the bishop, he knew how to set a trap and plant evidence to advance his own agenda. Attila was far from a thug, and was instead a cunning and calculating strategist. However, as earthquakes and battle scenes from the end times fill the life of Attila, another wave of mass action will be started by what can only be described as a love letter. In 450 AD, Attila was yet again visited by Romans, but this time it was not a diplomatic mission, but a single eunuch. Eunuchs would have been initially unsettling to Attila, as their voices were unusually high due to castration as boys. However, this eunuch had an offer of power the loot and hungry war chief could not refuse, and it involved a young woman named Honoria, who had sent the eunuch on this unauthorized mission. Honoria was the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian, and he had wanted to marry her off to a powerful leader. However, she had lost her virginity in a palace romance with a lowly servant, meaning she could not be married off as a virgin to a powerful foreign ruler. In a fury, Emperor Valentinian forced her to marry a merchant, and she decided to act. She had sent her eunuch to Attila's lands bearing a letter asking him to come and free her from the marriage, and to prove it came from her, she sent an expensive ring. Attila saw the ring and decided to move, but romance was the last thing from his mind. Attila sent word to the Western Romans that he was coming to claim Honoria as a wife, which would have been one of several he already had. In addition, he demanded she be made ruler of the Western Roman Empire, in essence demanding that he be made Western Roman Emperor. It was a move that Emperor Valentinian could not accept. Valentinian threatened to expel his sister, when his mother intervened, arguing her expulsion could be seen as a sign of weakness. She was instead married off to the merchant and lived out her days in the remote countryside of Italy. But now Attila was on the move. While he was at it, Attila's ambassadors had threatened the new emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, Marcian, as he wanted to test his commitment to the peace treaty. The Eastern emperor had heard of Attila's interest in Princess Honoria, so assumed he was focused on the west. The Eastern emperor sneered at Hun threats. Meanwhile, the Huns were on their way to the west, and Attila decided to repeatedly personally threaten Western Emperor Valentinian. On one occasion, a Hun ambassador entered the Roman palace and said to Valentinian, "Attila, my lord and your lord, has commanded you to prepare the palace for him." But this was not a crude threat barked by a Hun warlord through his ambassador. Like so much of what Attila did, there was a strategic logic to this threat. By personally threatening the emperor, Attila hoped the emperor would keep his troops in Italy to protect himself. This would mean Attila's real target, France, would only be defended by the Goths. Attila was confident he could beat the Goths, and he could beat the Romans, but not if the two teamed up together. His strategy of threatening the emperor was to try and ensure the frightened emperor would keep his troops in Italy to protect himself, leaving the Goths to stand alone against the Hun horde. Attila's campaign in France was ruthless, and just as the monks of the Eastern Empire had seen the Huns as a sign of the end of the world, so Western Christians would have their taste of the apocalypse. The city of Metz was ghoulishly plundered, with local legends stating the apostles had appeared in the sky and agreed to allow the city to be attacked as a punishment for its sins. At Reims, a priest was reading from Psalm 119 when a Hun raider charged into the church and beheaded him. The priest's mouth still kept speaking the psalm as the severed head rolled down the steps, and the deeply superstitious Huns were so unnerved they withdrew. At Orleans, a city close to where Joan of Arc would be born centuries later, the Huns were battering down the city gates when a dust cloud was sighted in the distance by lookouts on the city cathedral tower. The dust cloud was a Roman army sent to link up with the local Goths and confront Attila. Attila had badly misjudged the Romans, who had decided maintaining Roman rule in France was worth any risk, even if it meant leaving the emperor in Italy undefended. By this stage in history, Roman generals, not emperors, generally made the decisions. To Attila, the absolute ruler of his people, the idea a ruler could be overruled by generals was unthinkable, and may explain how he so badly miscalculated. The Roman generals made a decision that France was so important they would leave the emperor undefended while they went to fight for it. Even if Western Emperor Valentinian was personally threatened, a Roman emperor was easily replaced. By hard contrast, France, conquered at great cost by Julius Caesar centuries earlier, was not so easily replaced if it fell into Hun hands. As a result, Attila's nightmare of facing a combined force had come to life. The Roman army and their French Gothic allies confronted Attila in the Champagne region, at a battle now known as the Battle of the Catalonian Fields, and this is not to be confused with the Catalunya in Spain. This battle was intense, and the Huns suffered surprisingly heavy casualties. At one stage, the Huns fell back behind their line of wagons, and at Attila's orders, a pile of saddles was piled up. Attila then roared that if he was about to be taken alive, the saddles were to be set on fire so he could leap in and be burned to death rather than be taken alive by the Romans. The battle then continued with more heavy losses. The following day, Goth troops began marching away, and at first Attila thought this was a trick to lure his forces out onto open ground. Only when it became clear this was a real withdrawal did he permit his own troops to fall back. Attila's reputation and position were now at stake. He had gambled the Romans would not come and assist the Goths in France, and because they had, the victories and loot he had promised his men had not materialised. No Hun chief could ever survive if he was seen to have withdrawn in defeat. To salvage his reputation, Attila launched an attack on a virtually defenceless Italy. Italy had been stripped of troops which had been sent to confront him in France. The Romans believed the Huns would need at least several months to recover before attacking Italy, and this surprise attack, coming fresh off the Hun losses, caught them badly off guard. At Aquileia, the city was plundered and burned. Its once busy harbour soon silted up. The city's survivors fled across the lagoon and founded the modern city of Venice. One side effect of the looting and burning was a layer of ash fell on the church mosaics, beautifully preserving them, similar to what had happened at Pompeii. Attila then headed for Rome. By this stage, the Roman emperor was based in Ravenna, but Rome was still a huge prize. But what happened next is a mystery. Pope Leo I went out of the city, requesting parley talks with Attila. The two men were seen talking for some time, and then Attila's forces mysteriously withdrew. According to legend, St. Peter and St. Paul had appeared beside the Pope and scared Attila away. But a more likely explanation was that Attila's forces were at the very edge of their supply lines. Crop failures in the years before had meant that there was a lot less food to pillage in the Italian countryside than Attila had expected. His army needed food, and Italy itself could not provide it. Meanwhile, Attila heard news the Eastern Roman Emperor had sent an expeditionary army across the Danube to punish Hun people there. Attila raced back, concluding Rome was not worth a protracted siege with more pressing concerns afoot. Eastern Roman Emperor Marcian is said to have been kept awake for days at the thought of an angry and vengeful Attila coming his way with his Hun army. However, legend holds that one night an angel appeared at the emperor's bedside and broke a bow and arrow. This was a sign an enemy was about to be defeated, and in the morning news came to him that Attila was dead. Not dead on the battlefield, but having choked to death on a nosebleed whilst passed out drunk. For a warlord of global fame, it was a pitiful end, and without his charisma, power and ruthlessness, the Huns rapidly began to collapse as a unified force. His sons squabbled for control. One son, named Eonac, decided to withdraw from Europe and was never recorded in history again. Another brother, named Dengizic, scorned his brother as a coward and marched against the Eastern Roman Empire. He was defeated in battle and his head was cut off. His head was paraded through the streets to cheer in crowds, before being hung on the city walls of Constantinople to rot. Whilst Attila was dead and his Hun forces were gone, the damage they caused to Rome had a huge impact on its survival. The Huns raiding across Europe had driven many different tribes across the Roman border. These tribes then made themselves at home and were happy to use violence to remain in place. This inability to control these groups and their constant territorial ambitions meant that the empire itself was critically weakened from within, and Rome's internal authority weakened within. Just a few decades after Attila's death, Vandals and Goths, both of whom had been driven into the empire by the Huns in the first place, went one better than the Huns, and both sacked Rome in quick succession. The last Roman emperor was so irrelevant, he was simply pensioned off and sent to the countryside. The Hun menace only lasted a few decades, but its impact on the Roman Empire was devastating, and much of that can be attributed to Attila the Hun, who may have done more than any other man in bringing down the glory that was once Rome. Thanks for watching everyone, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you.